Hi, everyone. This is Brad Stone with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, where I serve or volunteer as a docent. I'm doing this presentation for the Passover season to talk about a couple of gentlemen that served in the United States Navy during the Civil War who were Jewish and happened to distinguish themselves. Now, the topic of Jews in the Civil War is a very big one, and there are a lot of great books and presentations on it. And I would encourage you to look at them. But I wanted to do something special for the museum by focusing in on two individuals. Now, let me assure everybody, whether you're Jewish or Christian, I think you'll find this interesting. And if you like the musical Hamilton, you'll particularly like it because I won't be singing or dancing during this presentation. Just kidding. Anyway, let's begin. The first person I'd like to focus in on is probably the more famous of the two. His name is Rio Levy, and this is a picture of him. He is born in 1792 in Philadelphia. And he's born to a fairly prosperous merchant family, but he is really intent on pursuing a career at sea. So much so that at age 10, he runs off and becomes a cabin boy. He will return to his family at age 14. By that time, they've agreed to let him pursue his chosen field. And he will go off and sort of rise up the ranks as a private commercial captain, and he makes a fairly good, successful career out of it. But when the War of 1812 comes, he decides he wants to do his patriotic service. He joins the Navy as a sailing master, and from that point on, he has decided he's going to stay in the Navy. Now, during the war itself, he serves with distinction aboard a ship called the Argus. It's one of the more famous ships of the War of 1812. It wreaks havoc upon British shipping around the British Channel. It will ultimately be captured, and much of the crew, including Levy, will serve out the remainder of the war at the British prison camp at Dartmouth, England. When he returns to the United States, he is indeed a hero, and again, he decides he's going to make a career in the Navy. In the decades that follow, he rises slowly up the ranks until in 1859 he is made a Commodore. That is the highest rank in the United States Navy, and he only held by a handful of people. Now, there are a couple of very interesting aspects to it. First of all, it would be remarkable for anyone to do this. But second of all, Uriah Levy is Jewish. And the Navy at the time was a very kind of traditional hidebound service. It's almost exclusively an officer corps of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There are some exceptions, but there are almost no Jews in the service. So for this guy to rise up to that rank is, pretty incredible. What's almost even more incredible is he is able to rise to this rank despite the fact that throughout his career he's court-martialed not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but 6 times. That is, a tough thing, a tough series of obstacles for anyone to overcome. Now, again, if you look at kind of the Wikipedia version of his life, it will say that these court-martials were done out of anti-Semitism. Some truth to that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But he is a phenomenal sailor. He is a phenomenal navigator. He is a phenomenal commander. He also does something else that's important. While he's in the Navy, he pushes for some crucial reforms in the service, one of which is the abolition of flogging. He is one of the main forces in that movement. And it's very important for a couple of reasons. One, flogging was often very barbaric. It was often done in a very arbitrary fashion. And a lot of people like Levy didn't think it was a particularly effective form of punishment. So what he proposed was to, first of all, do away with severe punishments like that and move to things that would actually change sailors' behavior in a proper way. So rather than flogging them, cut back on their grog ration or confine them to quarters or doing that sort of thing, which he believed, and I think most people would believe, were actually far more effective. The other thing he pushed for is to do away with the arbitrary nature of how punishment was implemented in the Navy. Very often, a sailor could be punished on the whim of an officer. And again, it was very arbitrary. There were kind of no rules or regulations in many cases. He pushed for there to be a systematic approach to how punishment was administered. And indeed, a lot of the recommendations he made and the reforms he pushed for make the foundation of modern jurisprudence in the United States Navy. So we owe a lot to him for that as well. And then the other thing he's known for is his generosity. And we'll talk a little bit more about the source of his generosity in a second, but he is someone who is very passionately drawn to the memory of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was an advocate for religious freedom. That's a cause very deep in the heart of Uriah Levy. His forefathers had come over to the American colonies at that time to escape religious intolerance in the form of the Inquisition. And so he wanted to honor Jefferson in any way possible. So he privately commissioned the statue of Thomas Jefferson that now sits in the United States Capitol. To this day, it is the only individually, privately financed statue that is in the Capitol. So we have him to thank for that. The other thing he did is he saved Monticello. He bought the Monticello property of Jefferson's just at the point where it was so dilapidated it was going to be torn down. He not only bought it and saved it from the wrecker's ball, but he invested quite a bit of money into restoring it into its full grandeur. He even went so far as to buy all the land that had been sold off during the decades to restore it to, the full estate that it had been at the time of Thomas Jefferson. So, again, a remarkable man. And that's what you would see if you looked at Wikipedia. But I think sometimes it's important to go a little bit beyond that and get really a fuller picture of the guy. And the fuller picture of the guy is he's not a saint by any means. And I think even his friends and family would say that he had a very hot temper, and very often he didn't conduct himself, particularly at a younger age, as an officer and a gentleman. For example, he killed a man in a duel over an argument that started on a dance floor. He would often find himself criticizing other officers, including sometimes his superiors, in ways that would not be acceptable now and certainly wouldn't be acceptable in the Victorian era of the Navy. He very often made mountains out of molehills when it came to just simple matters of shipboard etiquette. So was there anti-Semitism in some of the court-martials? Yeah. Sometimes he was brought up for charges that maybe other people they would have let slide. Sometimes the decisions or the verdicts were far more severe in his case than others would have received. In most of the cases or the court-martials he was involved with, the verdict was that he should be forced to leave the service. Now, fortunately, he had some good connections. He had a lot of friends in the Navy. His family had a lot of friends. And in a couple of cases, it went all the way up to the President of the United States, who would overturn these verdicts. But, Uriah Levy, particularly as a young man, would very often find himself narrowly escaping the end of his career. He would be counseled by friends, families, fellow officers. Okay, look, you got by it this time, but kind of like, reel in your anger, reel in your mouth. And he would immediately not do that. But over time, he became better at it. And again, in 1859, he does become a Commodore in the United States Navy. A very rare thing. Only a handful of people reach that rank. Now, it's kind of symbolic for him because he not only becomes the highest ranking member of the United States Navy at the outbreak of the Civil War, but he's also the highest ranking Jew in the United States government at the outbreak of the Civil War. The two other high ranking people in the United States government going into the war were two United States senators from the South who would both join the Confederacy when the war broke out. The most notable of the two was Uriah Benjamin, who would become the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, the third highest ranking official in the Confederate government. So for a lot of people in the North, particularly a lot of Jews, it really meant something to have Uriah Levy there as a symbol that, Jews did support the Union cause and were there to do everything they could to preserve it. Now, a little bit more of his unusual characteristics. So I mentioned his charity. Now, his charity was fueled by the fact that he was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. And it certainly wasn't from his naval salary, nor was it from his family, because again, he really never had any dealings with his family business. He made his own money, and he made it in New York City real estate. He was phenomenal at it. I sometimes tell audiences, it's hard to imagine that a senior official in the United States government would be known primarily for being a New York City real estate tycoon. Little joke there. But that's true in his case. Actually, through most of his career, he was actually known more for his dealings in New York City real estate than for his naval career. You might ask, well, how's it possible to balance both? Well, the truth of the matter was, before the Civil War, the United States Navy is very small. They have a lot more commanders than they do ships. So there would often be periods of many, many months, sometimes years, between a officer going off to overseas missions. So they'd have a lot of spare time. He used his dabbling in New York City real estate, and he was, again, phenomenally successful at it. And as a result, one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Now, he used that money for a variety of things. We talked about Monticello. We talked about the statue of Jefferson. He gave a lot of money to his temple and to other charities. Now, one of the other interesting things he did was he bought a lot of religious materials, a lot of religious tracts, to take with him on missions abroad. These included almost entirely Christian materials. He never bought any Jewish materials. Why? Well, he thought it was part of his mission whenever he went abroad on missions to distribute these materials to people from all walks of life. Now, people asked him, you're devoutly Jewish. Why are you distributing all this Christian material, Bibles, religious tracts, that sort of thing? And he answered that he believed that the religion of Christ, as he put it, was the most civilizing force on the face of the earth. So he wanted to do everything he could to proselytize for that religion. Sounds a little interesting, but, at some level it made sense to him. So that's what he did. Now, another interesting facet about the guy, he had an interesting marriage. His wife was 42 years younger than he was. He married her when she was only 15 years old. Now, in his defense, he knew that she was from a good family. The reason being is that she was his niece, and I do mean biological niece. Her name was Virginia Lopez, and by all accounts, she's a very beautiful, lovely young lady, great personality. even one of his neighbors who couldn't stand Uriah Levy, he referred to Uriah Levy as the Jew of all Jews. It wasn't meant as a compliment. Even this guy is enchanted by Levy's wife. He says she's one of the loveliest creatures that he ever met. And I think she may have helped Uriah Levy's career because he took her with him on even a cruise of the Mediterranean, and his fellow officers really took a shine to her, as did the men, and all the diplomats at the main ports he visited during that mission were also, very fond of her. So even though they had no children and they had a big gap in age, they seem to have had a very successful marriage. So Uriah Levy is a controversial figure during his time of service, but I think even his biggest detractors would say that overall he was a phenomenal seaman, he was a great commander, and he brought a lot of important reforms into the United States Navy. So again, not an angel, but a very remarkable man. Now, one of the questions I get sometimes is, how much of the problems he experienced were due to the fact that he was Jewish and there was anti-Semitism, and how much of it was just, the fact that he didn't have the greatest personality in the world? That's impossible to answer. But one person you can kind of compare and contrast him to is the other Jew that attains a very high rank during the Civil War. But I start out by saying that they're very different in terms of their ages. The other person I'm going to talk about is this gentleman here, Phineas Horowitz. He is born in 1822, so he's, about 30 years younger than Uriah Levy. So there's a big generational difference here that may account for how well they did in the service. It's a much different picture. Horowitz is kind of like the fair-haired boy of the Navy. They love him from the very beginning. A little bit about his background. He's born to a doctor. He decides to, pursue a career in medicine. He will go to the University of Maryland Medical School and then to the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. After medical school, he will be commissioned in the United States Navy as an assistant surgeon. He will serve with distinction in the Mexican-American War, so much so that he is personally decorated by Commodore Matthew Perry. He'll briefly leave the service to teach at the Jefferson Medical College, but then will return to the Navy in 1859. And he's immediately made the deputy or the assistant at the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. That's sort of the Navy's equivalent to the medical department of the Army. And the chief of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery in the Navy is comparable to the Surgeon General in the Army. So it's a fairly high-level post. Now, the person that holds that position during much of the Civil War is Surgeon William Wieland. William Wieland does a very good job. He has a lot of things to contend with during the war. There's a massive expansion of the Navy. He has to, in turn, increase their medical facilities. He does things like innovate things like the development of hospital ships, which we hear about in the news today. He also has to contend with how to bring in more physicians. At the outset of the war, the Navy has the same problem that the Army does in terms of its officer ranks. A lot of them go off to fight for the South. So Wieland is kept very busy during this whole period of time doing all this. It takes a tremendous, toll on him, and he will ultimately die in July of 1865. And at that point, Horowitz will take over that position. Again, it's comparable to the Surgeon General in the Army's medical department. He is a Commodore. Now, this is at a phenomenally young age. He's about 43 years old, I think. And it's an awesome responsibility. Now, even though Whelan did a good job with the Navy and all the things that he had to do, the problem was there was a mess in terms of paperwork. The records were in disarray. And this is at a time that the Army is doing an increasingly good job through the Army Museum of Medicine in making sure that records are actually very, very good. So, what Horowitz focuses on is trying to get the Navy's records in a similar position. And he actually makes sure that doctors are assigned to look over all the case records to get them to a quality that's comparable to what the Army has done. And he does a phenomenal job at doing that. So much so that when he decides to leave that position and head up the Navy's hospital in Philadelphia, the Navy urges Congress to appropriate a new salary, a new higher salary for him in honor of the work he's done. And Congress does that. So again, throughout his career, far from being court-martialed, the Navy continually honors and praises his work. From all accounts, a very popular guy. Remarkable at what he does. He will end his career in 1884 as a member of the Undersecretary of the Navy's Examining Board. His rank is comparable to what we would consider a Rear Admiral today. He will ultimately die in 1904. Again, a great American, a great patriot, a great surgeon. So I've tried to go over the career of these two remarkable men, and I think they both shine a light on the contributions made by Jewish Americans during the Civil War, and I hope you've enjoyed this. So, whether you celebrate Passover or whether you celebrate Easter, I hope you've enjoyed this video. And I also hope that you have a wonderful holiday season and that you all remain well. And when this is all over, I urge you to go to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick and other historic places like the historic ships in Baltimore Harbor. So again, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Bye-bye.